Hi everyone, my name is Mrs. Vrogap and I'm going to read Woosh, Lonnie Johnson's super soaking stream of inventions to you today. This was written by Chris Barton and it was illustrated by Don Tate. Now, I wanted to point out before beginning the story that this text was actually written as a narrative nonfiction. It's a biography, so it's telling us about Lonnie Johnson's life and some of the things that he accomplished throughout his life, but it's written as a story. It's written as a narrative. So when we read narrative nonfiction, we want to look at it and we want to read it in two ways. So we first want to read it as a story. We want to pay attention to the subject's traits, their motivations, their needs, struggles or threats they encounter in their life. And we also want to be wondering, what is the subject known for? And a second way we want to read narrative nonfiction is we want to look at it as an informational piece, right? Because we're learning about new topics. There might be main ideas and supportive points. So I want you to keep both of those ideas in mind as we read this text today. As a reminder, we will be using our narrative lens to look at this book primarily, but we will still be learning information. And just a reminder, our fifth graders have learned about ways complex nonfiction gets hard. So remember, vocabulary can be really, really hard and technical in these more complex texts. And sentences might be longer, but they're delivering more information. So we really just have to look carefully at each page and see what information we can learn from it. You ready? All right, let's take a look. Woosh, Lonnie Johnson's super soaking stream of inventions. And I love this title page and the inside cover because it's already showing us some of the things that Lonnie Johnson helped to create or invented. So here we have the super soaker water gun, hair curler apparatus, like a curling iron, toy parachute. Super cool. All right, let's get started. Oh, and you might notice throughout this book that I have a couple post-it notes. I'm the kind of reader who likes to really stop and think and stop and wonder about what I'm reading about. And I'm going to ask that you do the same at a couple moments throughout this story. I hope that's okay. All right, guys, here we go. Every day brought a challenge for young Lonnie Johnson. The challenge of finding space for all his stuff. 6 Johnson kids were squeezed into their parents' small house in Mobile, Alabama. Lonnie would have loved a workshop of his own, but there just wasn't room. There was nowhere to keep his rocket kits, and it kind of trails off. I'll come back to that. I just wanted to point out the word workshop. Near the bottom of this, it says Lonnie would have loved a workshop of his own. Now, when you hear the word workshop in here, I don't want you to be thinking about reading workshop and writing workshop. That's not the type of workshop he's talking about. He is someone who likes building and creating, so he's wishing that he had a room where he could keep all of his stuff, maybe with a workbench and some tools. So I just wanted to clarify that. Now, I'm going to go back here and reread just so I can make sure my reading voice is smooth as I continue the sentence onto the next page. There was nowhere to keep his rocket kits, bamboo shooters, rubber band guns, erector set, go-kart engine, bolts, and screws and other spare parts his dad let him bring in from the shed, and various other things he'd hauled back from the junkyard. Lonnie loved building and creating. Ideas for inventions just kept on flowing. So we already know the subject and the motivations, right? We know that Lonnie is our subject of this book, and we're learning that he's really motivated by figuring out how things work, by maybe taking things apart and putting them back together. Now, I want you to be wondering, what might he be known for? What might he be really famous for? We'll keep reading to find out. He learned how to make rockets from scratch. Kids at school gathered to watch Lonnie launch them, and he learned how to make rocket fuel. When it caught fire in the kitchen, Lonnie's mom didn't make him stop. She just sent him to work outside. Lonnie wanted to spend his life designing things, building things, and getting them to work. He wanted to be an engineer. However, Lonnie took an exam that said he would not make a very good one. His dream had been challenged. Lonnie was discouraged, but he knew that whoever had graded his test hadn't met links. Now, before we go on to the next page, I wanted to point out the word engineer. It was in this sentence. He wanted to be an engineer. An engineer is someone who uses math and science to create things that wouldn't otherwise exist in the real world, like in nature. And there are tons of types of engineers. I listed a couple on the slideshow a few slides back, but I also wrote down a couple here just so you could hear them. Like Some types of engineers are chemical engineers. They're people who work with more of the science piece, the biology. There are civil engineers who work to create things like roadways and bridges and sewers. There are electrical and mechanical and architectural engineers. There are engineers who work on things for NASA out in space. So there are so many of these engineers out creating things in our world. I heard that if you look around, about 90% of what you see was created by some kind of engineer, right? Almost everything around us in the room wouldn't exist if someone hadn't thought of it and made it. So there are so many types of engineers out there. I just wanted to point that out. I also wanted to point out the word discouraged. I know most of you probably have a good understanding for the word discouraged. He's let down. He's not feeling great, right? I wanted to point out the prefix dis, D-I-S. That often comes at the beginning of a lot of words, like disagreeable, dysfunction. If you disagree with someone, it means you don't agree, right? If something is in dysfunction, function means to work. If it's dysfunctional, it means it's not working. Whenever you see the prefix dis, D-I-S, I want you to think not or without. So he was without courage when his dream was challenged. Let's see if it changes or if it stays that way. Inspired by a TV show, Lonnie had built his own robot. He made it out of scrap metal and named it Lynx. Compressed air cylinders and valves allowed Lynx's body to turn and its arms to move. The switches came from an old, broken jukebox. Lonnie used a tape recorder to program Lynx, and as a bonus, the reels looked like eyes. Lonnie wanted to enter his creation in a science fair, but he couldn't get the transmitter to work. Without it, Lonnie couldn't send commands to Lynx. Wow. So we heard a couple of extra words. I just realized I put the sticky note on the wrong page, sorry. So we heard a couple of other really big technical words, and I want to make sure we have an understanding of those before we go on. So when you hear the word compressed, I had a slide, a couple slides back that showed a GIF of a baseball being compressed. It's when there's a lot of pressure put on something. You can compress objects like that baseball, or if you think about like a helium tank, that's where helium is put in a tank and it's actually compressed. So when you twist the little valve, it kind of comes out with like a hiss. It's pressurized and it's looking to escape that object that's holding it. They also talked about a transmitter. He said Lonnie couldn't get the transmitter to work. A transmitter, it says, without it, Lonnie couldn't send commands to Lynx. So based on the context of how that word is used, I'm understanding that the word transmitter is something that sends messages. It was supposed to send commands to Lynx, but it couldn't because it wasn't working. Science fairs came and went. Lonnie missed one, then another, then he got an idea. Now, Lonnie may or may not have asked before he borrowed his little sister's walkie-talkie, but it fixed the transmission issue. His school's team took freshly fixed Lynx to a 1968 science fair at the University of Alabama, where only 5 years earlier, African-American students hadn't even been allowed. Having to compete in a place that still wasn't very welcoming, now that was a challenge with a capital C. Against other schools from all over the state, Lonnie's team won first place. Soon, Lonnie left home to go to college at Tuskegee Institute, where he stood out as a self-confident, insightful, creative thinker. Now, those traits, self-confident, insightful, creative thinker, made me wonder about some other traits that Lonnie might have. Now, Lonnie is someone who really likes to study problems, right? So the word analytical came to mind. He analyzes, he studies closely. So I'm just going to write down a couple of Lonnie's traits here. Maybe you have some other ideas. He's someone who analyzes a lot. He's very creative, right? He comes up with really cool problems or really cool ways to solve problems. He's definitely brave if he's doing things that people before him hadn't gotten a chance to do. Maybe investigative. That kind of goes alongside with analytical. He's looking closely at the problems and really trying to figure out what the problem might be or how he could solve it. So maybe I'll write investigative. All right, I'll keep reading. He stood out as a student who asked the right questions, precisely defined problems, and formulated solutions. That's kind of a big word there. Remember, we said we're going to read some really technical, big vocabulary. When I hear the word formulated in this sentence, he stood out as a student who asked the right questions, precisely defined problems, and formulated solutions. Using that context around that word, I'm thinking formulated might mean makes solutions, right? Like he's looking closely at the problems and then he's making or creating solutions. And he stood out as the guy who built his own booming sound system out of cast-off electronics. It even had lights that flashed in sync with the beats. Lonnie sometimes studied right in the middle of his own parties. The extra studying paid off. He became an engineer after graduation, and that took him beyond Alabama, way beyond. All right, before I turn the page, just make a quick prediction about what the author is trying to tell us here. Let me read that sentence again. He became an engineer after graduation, and that took him beyond Alabama, way beyond. And the author actually used a different type of font. They changed this to be italicized. So whenever I see that in a text, it tells me to put a little extra emphasis, a little extra feeling into the word. So it's not just way beyond, it's way beyond. When NASA was sending an orbiter and probe called Galileo to Jupiter, the space agency needed to ensure a constant supply of power to the orbiter's computer memory. The engineer who had to figure out how to do it was Lonnie. Okay, so when they said way beyond, I think they were kind of hinting at the idea of space. So now his work isn't just staying here on Earth, it's going out into outer space. They used a couple more technical words in here, orbiter and probe, and I just wanted to point those out. They have a little diagram of Galileo here. An orbiter is something that orbits. It goes around. So if you think about the moon, that orbits the Earth, right? It goes around the Earth. The Earth orbits the sun. When they send an orbiter into outer space, it kind of looks like a rocket ship, but it's meant to orbit or go around something else that isn't Earth. So they were sending it to Jupiter, so it's probably going around Jupiter, right? And a probe is just a scientific piece of equipment that collects energy. So like the Mars rover is an example of a probe that actually landed on Mars and collected information and sent it back. It transmitted back information to Earth to teach us about some of these other planets. His challenge was to come up with a lightweight backup system able to keep essential functions going in case the main power was lost. And I wanted to point out the word essential as one more vocabulary word. Essential means necessary. So he needed to come up with a system that kept those necessary functions going in case the power was ever lost. It wasn't easy. It wasn't obvious, but Lonnie found a solution. Some at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory doubted his idea would work. Lonnie convinced them it would. He was right. As it photographed Jupiter and its moons, Galileo was supported by the power package that Lonnie designed. Much of what we know about Jupiter could have been at risk in a power failure, if not for Lonnie. Ideas for other problems to solve just kept on flowing. They flowed whether Lonnie was working with hundreds of people at NASA or up late tinkering with his own inventions in finally his own workshop. Lonnie knew that the world's millions of refrigerators and air conditioners needed a new cooling system, one that didn't use R12, a chemical that was bad for the environment. He had an idea for using water and air pressure instead. To test his idea, he made a pump and a nozzle, connected it to the bathroom faucet, turned on the faucet, turned on the pump, and then whoosh! The stream that blasted across the bathroom was so powerful it created a curtain-swirling breeze. It also gave Lonnie an idea for yet another invention. This, he thought, would make a great water gun. First, he had to find or make the parts, including a pump small enough for a child to handle. Then, he had to glue the parts together into a prototype, an early version with room for improvement, kind of like a rough draft. Finally, Lonnie tested his strange-looking squirt gun at a picnic. Does it really work? A man asked. Sure, Lonnie said. Want to see? Lonnie worked the pump, which squeezed air into a chamber. When he pulled the trigger, the air escaped, forcing water out with a whoosh. For a water battle to be a fair fight, there couldn't be just one of Lonnie's water guns. He needed help making more. So he went to a toy company, after toy company, after toy company. No, 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 no. The word no flowed again and again. But finally, one company said yes. It planned to make his water gun. Lonnie also had other projects: a water-propelled toy airplane, 2 kinds of engines, and a cooling system. He found investors to provide the money for turning his ideas into products people could buy. He made a leap of faith, quit his day job, and devoted himself to full-time inventing. But soon, each plan fell apart, even the one for the water gun. These things sometimes happen, but when they happen one after another to the same person, well, that's some pretty bad luck. Lonnie didn't have a job. He didn't have the money he'd been counting on. He and his family had to move out of their home and into a little apartment. He was angry and scared. Now, let's look at this text through our narrative lens again. How do you think he's feeling? Remember back when he was feeling discouraged after taking that test? I wondered if maybe he's feeling discouraged again. But based on what we know about Lonnie's traits, he's tenacious. He doesn't stop. He's a problem solver. I'm going to infer that he's not going to stop here. I think you guys might agree with me. What do you think? So let's keep reading. But Lonnie had dealt with challenges all his life. He knew a lot about solving problems, and he still believed in his inventions, especially the water gun. Lonnie went looking for another toy company. In 1989, he found a toy maker who was interested in seeing the water gun if Lonnie ever happened to be in Philadelphia. But don't make a special trip, the guy said. Lonnie made a special trip. I mean, wouldn't you? If someone finally said, hey, I'll take a look at it, but only the next time you're in my city. And he'd been waiting for so long to do this. Looks like he just hopped on an airplane and made it work. In his wife's suitcase, he carried a new prototype. He unpacked it, filled the tank with pressure, pumped the gun until air pressure was good and high, and... You ready for this page? Whoosh! I kind of like how this page goes. This one actually folds out. Wow! They're all clapping and cheering and getting soaked. Kids everywhere agreed that, wow, Lonnie's water gun, called the Super Soaker, became a smash hit. In no time, there were super soakers in backyards and on beaches, in parks and on playgrounds. Each sale of a super soaker put a little money into Lonnie's pocket. All those hours, all those years that Lonnie spent in his workshop had paid off big time. Now he could afford to do just about anything he wanted. So what did Lonnie do? He got a bigger workshop, which is where you'll find him today. Because facing challenges, solving problems, and building things are what Lonnie Johnson loves to do. And his ideas just keep on flowing. Now, before we end the story, I wanted to point out one more word. You might have picked up on this as I was reading. The author kind of used this word choice again and again. His ideas just kept on flowing. And I was wondering, why do you think the author did that? Maybe just take a second to either turn and talk with a partner if your teacher wants to pause, or you can just do some wondering by yourself. Why do you think the author chose to use that language? His ideas just kept on flowing. All right, and here's our last page that I wanted to show you. There is a note from the author, which I'm not going to read at this time, but I did want to point out a few other inventions that Lonnie is known for. This one is a liquid-propelled transporter toy, rocket toys, and portable multimedia projections. So I told you guys that we'd be looking at this story through our narrative lens, but we'd be reading it as a story and as information. So you learned a lot about Lonnie Johnson as a character or as a person. Now I'm wondering if you can think about him as a subject and maybe some of the topics that you learned about through this book. So maybe think about some new ideas that you learned about, maybe some of the inventions he's responsible for creating. Thank you guys for taking a few minutes to listen to this story. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.